So I totally forgot to record a video. So I did really good on this history project. And it'd just be nice for me to get a video out. So that's why I'm gonna do this now. So Cuba by me, Mullins. When did Cuba become independent? Cuba tried many times to become independent. One of the first times they really strived for it was in their 10-year war from 1868 to 1878. Cuba demanded its independence, but Spain did not give it, since God had given them that land. They finally gained their independence in 1902 after they made a deal with Spain, but who inspired them to keep fighting? The father of independence. Born in 1853, José Julián Martí y Pérez, better known as just José Martí, was called the father of independence. Martí was regarded a lot for his literary works. When he was 16, he founded his first newspaper named La Patria Libre. Soon after this, he found himself in trouble for calling the pro-Spanish Cubans apostates. After this, he was sentenced to banishment in Spain and got exiled from Cuba for 8 years. During his banishment, he spent his time completing his education and then plotting as to how Cuba can gain its independence again. And he got smarter. Martin knew that if he let things be, Cuba would become either an authoritarianism, a dictatorship, or both. That is why in 1892 he formed the Cuban Revolutionary Party and took political leadership. He worked for years to form a rebellion and get resources from allies, including the U.S. In 1895, when he was prepared to enact the rebellion, the ship the U.S. sent to Havana had blown up on its way overseas. Martí's plan failed, and he feared the future of Cuba, so he tried fleeing to the U.S., but he ended up dying in a skirmish before he could. He inspired Cubans to keep fighting. But why Cuba? Because God said so. Spain wanted Cuba because they claimed that the land was given to them by God and that they were entitled to it. The real reason was that Cuba was a huge moneymaker for Spain. Spain liked the fact that they were able to sell Cuba many slaves since there was so much unused land, perfect for plantations. Cuba had the largest sugar industry in the entire world at that point. With all the slaves and farming, Cuba produced 1/3 of the entire world's sugar, which is equivalent to just a lot of money for Spain. Current day trade. Cuba still has a very large stake in the cane sugar industry today, but that isn't the only thing that they trade. Nowadays, Cuba's largest export comes from medicine and pharmaceuticals, tobacco, oil, and metals. They've also made significant investments in space and aircraft as well as automobiles and other machinery.
The following few slides were created with a bias towards Fidel Castro and are not entirely accurate but make it sound really smart to impress my history teacher. Thanks. Enjoy.
1926 to 2016. Fidel Castro ruled in Cuba from 1958 to 2008. Castro was famous for many reasons in Cuba, and whilst in America he's often considered a violent dictator, in Cuba he is considered a hero. Castro saved Cuba from their previous dictator and reformed their entire government. He gave the people political and civil liberties. But why do Americans consider him such a villain? Well, America is known for really not liking communism. So when Castro opened up trade with the Soviet Union, America immediately broke up diplomatic relations with Cuba and began to fear such a nearby country becoming communist. And in order to try and stop Cuba from working with Soviets or become communist, America cut off all trade with Cuba and then sent a small army of Cuban exiles back to Cuba to try and overthrow Castro's rule. Cubans defended Castro and fought off the army, and the Soviet Union supported Cuba with guns and resources. If you've heard of the Cuban Missile Crisis, here's where it starts. Prior to the attack in 1962, Castro made an agreement with the Soviet Union to station missiles in Cuba that would drop nuclear warheads on different cities in America. America, not wanting to get nuked, made a deal with the Soviet Union and Cuba saying, if you take your warheads out of Cuba, we'll take ours out of Turkey and stop trying to overthrow Fidel. After this, Castro led Cuba to establish a socialist state, but it wasn't in the same way everyone thought they would. Castro created a one-party system, but also created a national assembly in which he was voted to be president of. He had complete control over Cuba, but the people liked it that way, and if they were to decide that he was unfit to remain as leader, they would vote someone else to take office, as they did in 2008, making Fidel's brother Raul Castro their new leader. While there are many conflicting takes surrounding the matter, Fidel Castro has proved to be a very effective leader that Cuba definitely needed. Amelia Casanova de Villaverde, alive from 1832 to 1897. Amelia Casanova was born into a very wealthy, yet conservative Spanish family in Cuba, but she still had the beliefs, as many other Cubans, that Cuba should have the right to be ruled as its own country. When she was 19 years old, she moved to America and got married. She began to get connected with groups of Cuban exiles and became a very active member of her community. She made many connections with her local government and eventually got to the point where she was at the U.S. Capitol criticizing Congress for their treatment of the Cuban people and then supporting the Spanish colonial rule instead of helping Cuba become independent. She also continued visiting Cuba and made her old home a home for the revolutionaries to take refuge and to meet up. She used her money and connections to fight for Cuban independence, and 1 year after her death in 1897, it finally happened. America stated that they would support Cuba's independence and made a deal with Spain to grant them that, and all of that wouldn't have happened without Amelia Casanova. The present-day major event is the fact that the workers in Cuba look up to one thing every year: Mayday. Mayday in Cuba is similar to American Labor Day, and it is taken very seriously. Every year, thousands of people gather in the capital, Havana, for a parade. That is, except for this year, 2023, when it was canceled due to acute fuel shortages in Cuba. This tradition has not been broken since 1959 because of economic reasons, and all the workers and fans of the celebration hope that it will never occur again. Works cited page, works cited page. Thank you very much, dear viewer, for listening to my 10 out of 10 presentation